All right, time for another 2024 college football season team preview and prediction. We're going to go game by game. Up today, the Georgia Bulldogs. Shout out to, well, everybody over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. The support you guys give me over there is unbelievable. I've told you before, but without the support I get from you all over there, I would not be able to do this full time. So big shout out to everybody over there. And this is a time of year where we really start ramping up over there. We've been doing a bunch of college football, 25 video game streams over there. And of course, with the season coming up, we stream almost all day every Saturday during the football season over on the Patreon page. So there's a link in the description of this video. If you haven't checked out the Patreon page, make sure you do. We have a really good time over there. To those of you that like to sign up during the season and then drop off in the off season, this is your reminder. It's time to get back on. I had a Patreon stream yesterday with the college football 25. I took an absolute beating. I threw 7 interceptions. I almost broke the remote. Luckily I didn't, or the remote control, the controller, whatever it's called. Luckily I didn't. It's the only one I have. But a bunch of people over on the Patreon page requested this Georgia preview and prediction video. Of course, I've done a whole series of these, about 20 of them now. There's a playlist called 2024 Predictions here on the channel. You can click that playlist and it'll bring up a list of all the teams that I've done so far. Feel free to click back and check out whatever teams it is that might interest you. All right, let's talk about Georgia for 2024. Kirby Smart returns for, what is this, his 9th year now? 16, 17, 18, 19, 22, 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, 9th year, I guess. A lot of success the last few years for Georgia under Kirby Smart. 2 national titles, an SEC title, a bunch of 10, 11, 12 win seasons. Georgia has not lost a regular season game since COVID. You know, all the way back to 2020 to find a regular season loss for Georgia. In fact, nobody not named Alabama has beat Georgia since the COVID year. Florida was the last team other than Alabama that beat Georgia, and that was 2020, the COVID year. But times are changing. Things are different in the SEC. Gone are the divisions. 2 new teams are in Texas and Oklahoma. We've got all new schedules. And while a lot has been made of Florida's schedule heading into the 2024 season, and it is brutal, particularly the back half of that thing, the last 5 or 6 games are all against top 15 teams. Georgia has a pretty difficult schedule this year as well, particularly on the road. Again, we're going to put the schedule up in a minute and go through it game by game. But before we get there, let's break Georgia down a little bit. Offensively, defensively, coaching staff, what they lose from last year, what they bring in new for this year, transfer portal, recruiting, that kind of thing. Let's start with the offense. Mike Bobo is back as offensive coordinator. Carson Beck is back as quarterback. Kirby Smart is back as head coach. Not very many of the top teams can say that heading into 2024, and I do think it's an obvious advantage. If you look at sort of the list of most people's top 4 or 5 teams, right, you're going to see teams like Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, Bama, Ole Miss, Tennessee, so forth and so on. You start to go through that list, you look at Ohio State, they've got a new quarterback and a new offensive coordinator. You look at Alabama, they've got a brand new head coach and an entirely new coaching staff and a new defensive coordinator. Texas, they're intact. Quinn Ewers is back. The coaching staff is back. You look at Oregon, most of the coaching staff intact, but they've got a brand new quarterback in transfer, Dylan Gabriel. Tennessee, coaching staff returns, brand new quarterback, first-year starter, Nico, I'm about to leave ya. Ole Miss returns. But anyway, so Georgia is one of the few top-ranked teams in the country to return head coach, both coordinators, and the starting quarterback. That's obviously a huge advantage. Carson Beck had one of the best years that any Georgia quarterback has ever had last season, going just off the numbers. He threw for a ton of yards, ton of touchdowns, very few interceptions in his first year as a starter, and he looks, of course, obviously to make another step forward this year, which will be his 5th year at UGA, but only his 2nd year starting. He came in during that COVID class of 2020. So he's, 2021, 22, 23 to 24 will be his 5th year, 2nd year starting. He's near the top or at the top of almost every single Heisman list that you see. Him and Dylan Gabriel, the 2 betting favorites to win the Heisman. He should have another really good year. He loses a couple of weapons, most notably Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers. Georgia's going to have to try to replace that. And while they don't have any elite wide receivers, they've got several above average wide receivers, which we're going to talk about here in a second. The one knock on Carson Beck, if there is one, I guess, is his sort of, I don't really want to say lack of mobility. He's not a statue, but he's not Jaden Daniels at LSU from last year, or even Caleb Williams at Southern Cal, or Shedeur Sanders, or any of these quarterbacks that can run around a little. he can pick up a first down for you, Carson Beck, with his legs, 3rd and 4. He can get you 5 yards, that kind of thing. He has shown the ability to escape pressure from time to time and extend some plays. But in no world would anybody look at Carson Beck and classify him as any kind of dual threat quarterback or sort of, a quarterback that has the potential of hitting a home run with his legs, like, say, a Jalen Mildew from Alabama. He's more of a traditional pocket passer. And in today's age of college football, we're seeing more and more teams sort of move to the more athletic, mobile QB, and we'll see if Georgia goes that direction in the future. But if you were going to knock Carson Beck or sort of deduct points for any one particular thing, I guess that would be it. But he's expected to have a really good year. The offensive coordinator is back, Mike Bobo. I don't understand Georgia fans, some of them anyways, fascination with not liking Mike Bobo. If you look at the best offensive seasons in Georgia history and you pick out the top 3 or 4, Bobo was the offensive coordinator for all but one of them in terms of points per game, total yards, best seasons that quarterbacks have ever had, sort of whatever sort of top line offensive categories you want to look at. Bobo has been the OC for 3 of the 4. The other one was, what's his name? From the national title teams that's gone off to the NFL now. Why am I drawing a blank on his Monken? Jesus. Todd Monken. Todd Monken had some great seasons, but you got Todd Monken, who's considered to be maybe the best offensive coordinator Georgia has ever had. But right under that is Mike Bobo. I mean, the guy averaged 40-something points a game last year. He averaged 40 points a game when he was the offensive coordinator back in, I think it was 2014, his last year as offensive coordinator. I think he's a really good offensive coordinator. He gets hated on because Georgia, I guess, didn't score 100 points against Alabama in the SEC championship game. But here's some breaking news for you. Go back and look at how many points Todd Monken's offense scored against Alabama in the SEC championship game the year Georgia won it all. They lost to Bama. And Bobo's offense scored more points with Carson Beck than Monken's offense did with Stetson Bennett. Now, I'm not saying that to convince you that Bobo's better than Monken. I think Monken's better than Bobo, but I think Bobo's a really good offensive coordinator and a really good offensive mind. And obviously, Carson Beck works real well with him. Let's take a look at Georgia's wide receiver situation. Of course, they lose Ladd McConkey and tight end Brock Bowers to the NFL. And neither one of those guys can be replaced, in my opinion. Georgia doesn't have anybody on their roster, any one person that can step in and give them what Brock Bowers gave them, and they don't have any one person that can step in and give them what Ladd McConkey gave them. What they do have is a group of 4, 5, 6 wide receivers that are going to rotate in and out. They've got sort of some of each of the style of wide receiver that maybe you're looking for. They've got some of the smaller slot type guys that are fast and shifty like McConkey was. I'm talking, of course, about guys like Dom Lovett, Dylan Bell, Dom Lovett and Dylan Bell. On the outside, they bring Colby Young in through the transfer portal from Miami. Now, that spot probably would have been a Ra Thomas on the outside. Of course, he's gone. I'm going to talk about that in a second. He probably would have started at that outside wide receiver spot. Now, Georgia for years has rotated wide receivers in and out at an obnoxious pace, in my opinion. One of the knocks on Georgia as a program overall is their lack of 1,000-yard wide receivers. You may or may not know this, but in the history of Georgia football, they've only had one wide receiver go for 1,000 yards, and it only happened once, and it's back in 2002. Terrence Edwards. Nobody since then, no Georgia wide receiver has had 1,000 yards receiving since then. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that Georgia just doesn't land your sort of top line wide receiver recruits out of high school. They just don't. Every once in a while, they sort of will bring one of those types of players or potentially one of those types of players in. George Pickens comes to mind. Obviously, A.J. Green in the late 2000s. Neither one of those guys ever got to 1,000 yards. But when you look at Georgia's wide receiver room over the years, what you normally see is a group of wide receivers somewhere between slightly below average to slightly above average. I'm talking about as a group now. Nobody has ever looked at Georgia's wide receiver room and goes, now that could rival Ohio State. They just don't get those types of wide receivers. Now, Georgia recruits very well overall, top down, right? But if you're going to pinpoint one position where they sort of seem to miss more often than not on their number one targets at the wide receiver or number one targets out of high school, would be the wide receiver position. So you look at these guys, none of them are going to have 1,000 yards in my opinion, but you're going to have several guys, 4 or 5 probably, maybe even 6 in the 400 to 600 yard range. They rotate wide receivers in and out, like I mentioned, at an obnoxious pace. Now at the tight end position, you of course have Oscar Delp. He's back for his 3rd year. He's really, really good. Were it not for the fact that Georgia just had Brock Bowers for 3 years, people would be looking at Oscar Depp like he's one of the best tight ends potentially that Georgia's ever had. He's really good. But he's no Brock Bowers. They bring a kid in from Stanford out of the transfer portal who looked good at Stanford, but, I'll admit, that's against Pac-12 defenses and things like that. We'll see how he sort of transition and fits in there at Georgia against some of these better defenses in the SEC. They still have a couple of young guys, too, that can get in on the rotation. So it's going to be kind of a committee deal, both at tight end and wide receiver, in an effort to replace Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. They don't have anyone that can do it, but with Carson Beck taking a step forward in his second year at the quarterback position, I would be surprised if Georgia's passing game took a step backwards in 2024 versus what we saw in 2023. Again, there is no McConkey, there is no Bowers, there is nobody that can replace him. I'm going to say it a bunch of times because even though I'm saying it a bunch of times, there's going to be a bunch of people in the comments of this video that go, well, without Bowers and McConkey. I know, we don't have Bowers and McConkey. I'm willing to bet Carson Beck throws for just as many yards this year, if not more, than he did last year with those two guys. It'll just be spread out a little bit more. When you look at the running back situation, they bring E.T. in from Florida through the transfer portal. Robinson is back. Again, I don't think Georgia's running back room, I said this last season, I caught some hate for it. I think I was right. I think I'm right again now. I like Georgia's running backs. They've got good running backs. If they stay healthy, they can have a really good running game as a team. But when you look at this running back room, there is no standout like there has been in a lot of years past for UGA. There's not a running back on this team that is as good as anybody I'm about to name. And this goes all the way back to 2013, or 2012, really. Todd Gurley, Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, Kenny McIntosh. For 10 years, Georgia had one or more of those players in their running back room. Nobody on the team right now is any of that. Similar to a group approach to replace McConkey and Bowers, it's going to be a group approach at running back. No running back for Georgia is going to average 20 carries a year. It's just not going to happen. You're looking at several running backs, probably 3, that are going to average between 8 and 12 carries a game. That's what I think. I think they're all good. I don't think any of them are great. I don't think any of them are first-round NFL picks or anything like that. But Georgia will have a good running game behind this offensive line. It's an offensive line that returns 4 starters from last year, one of the best offensive lines in the country last year. They returned 4 starters, and they returned 2 additional guys who played a ton last year because of injuries and rotation. So they've got 6 experienced offensive linemen. They'll figure out the best 5. That's who we'll see starting week 1 against Clemson, but I expect Georgia to have a really good offensive line. All right, let's run through the defense, and then I'll talk a little bit about the arrest situation at UGA, and then we'll move on to the schedule. Defensively, I've got a couple of concerns here. Number 1, the interior of the defensive line. Number 2, the secondary, particularly the outside, the corners. All right, let's start with the defensive line. I like Stackhouse. I like Brinson. I like a couple of young guys that we have, freshmen and sophomores. Again, sort of like the Ladd McConkey, Brock Bowers running back deal on offense. None of those people are Jalen Carter or Jordan Davis. They're just not. And we saw that manifest itself last year for Georgia in that SEC championship game against Alabama, where Georgia got absolutely dominated on the line of scrimmage. There's just no other way to put it. There's no other way to say it. If you watch that game and you watch the game from the inside out, instead of just focusing on the quarterback on every play or the wide receivers, Georgia got beat along the lines of scrimmage in that game. Bad. These guys are going to have to play better. They're both upperclassmen. There are some young guys that are going to step in and play, but Georgia, whether it comes from Stackhouse, Brinson, one of the younger guys, a true freshman, whoever it is, as a group, the interior of this defensive line has got to play better, or else Georgia is not going to have the season that they want to have. They're just not. There are too many other teams in the SEC with legitimate lines of scrimmage, particularly offensive lines, that will be able to handle them as a whole if they play like they played last year. They've got to play better. Now let's move to the outside, the defensive ends and the outside linebacker type positions. Mykel Williams. I love Mykel Williams. He's been playing and starting since he was a freshman. He hasn't started every game. He's a rotational player, some. he has to play up to his potential this year. There are times where he has played and he's looked unstoppable. There are times where he's played and he's looked like he's one of the best outside linebacker / edge rush players Georgia's ever had. They've sort of gone back and forth with him between kind of a hybrid defensive end outside linebacker position. He's had his hand in the dirt half the time. He's been standing up half the time. It looks like they're going to do a lot more of him standing up on the outside this season, which I think suits him better. But he's got to play up to his potential. He's got All-American potential. He's got first-round NFL draft pick potential. I saw a Pro Football Talk or whatever that vlog or website is that always talks about college football players and how they may pertain to the NFL. And he says Michael Williams is the most talented NFL prospect on Georgia's roster. I don't disagree, but he's got to live up to that kind of a hype. If you're a Georgia fan, I'll give you kind of an example here of what I see when I see Michael Williams. I see a Lorenzo Carter / Leonard Floyd type of player on the outside there. Big body, big wingspan, has the speed, has the quickness, has the size, has everything physically that you would want, has all the ability in the world. What was the difference between Lorenzo Carter and Leonard Floyd? Well, Leonard Floyd was really, really good at Georgia, and Lorenzo Carter never lived up to the hype. That's just the reality of the situation. Now, Lorenzo Carter wasn't bad. He got drafted. He's had a successful NFL career. But in terms of what he did at Georgia, it was a little bit of a disappointment in my mind for Lorenzo Carter based on his potential and ceiling. Whereas Leonard Floyd knocked it out of the park. He was unstoppable at Georgia. Where is Michael Williams going to fall on that scale? In my opinion, he's been closer to Lorenzo Carter so far up to this point in his time at UGA. We need him. Georgia needs him to play more of a Leonard Floyd type of role this year. He's got double-digit sack potential, setting the edge against the run, things like that. He is like I said, he's a potential All-American and could potentially be one of, if not the best players this season on Georgia's defense. Let's move back to the linebackers. I think Georgia has the best inside linebacker room in the country. There are linebackers that are better than anybody Georgia has. I don't think Georgia will have a Butkus Award winner this season. I think they could potentially have one next season in C.J. Allen. C.J. Allen's a true sophomore. He's a freshman last year. Didn't start in the beginning of the year, but he played in every single game. And as the season went on, he got more and more playing time and eventually became the starter due to injury to Pop Johnson, who has now transferred because C.J. Allen was so good when he came in last year. It became obvious to anybody with a set of eyes Pop Johnson's playing time was about to get drastically reduced, so he transferred out. C.J. Allen, in my mind, is one of the best inside linebacker prospects Georgia's ever had. He looks like he was built in a lab to play inside linebacker. He's got the sideline to sideline speed. He can hit. He can rush the passer. He can blitz. He's great against the run. He's good in coverage. He literally does it all. True sophomore. Next to him, we'll have Smile Munden, another guy we're going to talk about in a second when we talk about Georgia's arrest problems this offseason. And then their backups, guys like Wilson, Walker. I mean, Georgia is absolutely loaded. You go back and you look at the last 2 or 3 recruiting classes for Georgia. They've signed 2 or 3 of the best inside linebackers in the country every single year for the last 2 or 3 years. Georgia is having NFL inside linebackers transfer out of their program. That's how deep they are. Everybody knows Georgia has recruited unbelievable under Kirby Smart. The last 3 or 4 years, which is what makes up the current roster, is all top 3 classes. No position have they recruited better than inside linebacker. They're absolutely loaded there in one of the best inside linebacker rooms in the country. And I think C.J. Allen, he could win the Butkus Award this year, but I think it's more likely. There's some really good inside linebackers this year. You look up at Ohio State, you look even at Penn State, all over the place. There's some great inside linebackers everywhere. Next year could be C.J. Allen's year for the Butkus Award, but he's gonna be great. Let's move back to the secondary. Safeties, I have got zero concerns at all. Malachi Starks is one of the best 5 safeties in all of college football. You're talking Malachi Moore at Bama, Caleb Downs, however you want to classify it. He's in everyone's top 5 when you talk about top 5 safeties in all of college football. He's been starting since his very first game at Georgia as a true freshman against Oregon 2 years ago, where he had an interception in his first game, and he's just continued to play at a high level week in and week out. He's a first-round NFL draft pick and one of the best players on Georgia's defense. Next to him, little bit of a question mark. We've got some experienced players there and guys like Dan Jackson, who's been there for 100 years. And we've got 5-star KJ Bolden, who I think is probably too good to keep off the field. Every single year, there's a couple of true freshmen that find their way onto the field defensively for Georgia. And even if you hate Georgia, you have to admit their defense is just loaded with NFL players every single year. If you're so good as a true freshman that you're playing on Georgia's defense, whether you're starting or not is irrelevant. If you're playing meaningful snaps in the first and second quarter for Georgia on defense as a true freshman, you're an elite talent. And KJ Bolden, in my mind, falls into that category. Will he play the first snap of the season at safety? I don't know. but I do think he will play in every single game early, often, every quarter, and could be a starter by the end of the year. The outside, like I mentioned, the corners is where I have some questions. You have some guys like Dalen Everett and some other guys that have some experience, but I question whether or not Georgia has a true lockdown corner. They've been blessed the last several years with one of those almost every single year. You go all the way back to your Tyson Campbells, your Eric Stokes, of course, Keely Ringo. They have had one of these sort of, top 2 NFL draft pick type, first or second round, not top 2, type corners that you could kind of trust on an island. They don't have an obvious one of those this season. They've got really good corners. They've got corners that will play in the NFL. Don't know that they've got a lockdown corner. At least one would experience sort of a top 2 round NFL draft pick type of guy. They do have Ellis Robinson, a true freshman, 5-star corner, number 1 rated corner in last year's class. And again, corner, to me, is probably the second hardest position to play in college football, as a freshman transitioning from high school to college. Quarterback obviously being number 1. Maybe you throw left tackle in there too. It's really hard to play corner. You're on an island. You're by yourself. You're playing against, especially in the SEC, some of the best athletes on the planet in terms of speed, size, and athleticism. I hope Ellis Robinson is so good that they have to play him, because I am worried about Georgia on the outside, and it would be nice if Ellis Robinson right away was good enough to fill in one of those 2 spots, but we'll see. All right, Georgia's arrest situation. I'm not going to get into any of the details and judging the players or Kirby. I've done all that. My thoughts are well known. It's ridiculous. It's unacceptable. Kirby's got to get a hold of it. I'm not talking about the players. I'm not judging the players. People make mistakes. People deserve second chances. I understand all that. I'm talking about the program as a whole, top down. Kirby's responsible for everything that happens, and 25 arrests and 2 dead bodies in the last 18 months is unacceptable. And whatever Kirby is doing, and he is trying, it's not that he's not doing anything. He is trying. He's brought speakers in. He's suspended players. He's whatever he does to them punishment-wise in practice. They've been fined through NIL. It's not that he's not doing anything. But whatever he's doing is not working. He had 4 or 5 arrests just in the last 30 days. And this isn't just young kids who are kind of learning the ropes. Miles Monday, a starting inside linebacker and potential captain of this defense, was arrested just a few weeks ago for racing with a true freshman. So he's got to change the approach of what he's doing, and he's got to get it reined in. But for the purposes of this video, let's just talk about what that means for this season, because this is a season preview and prediction video. He has said he's going to suspend players. Now, Kirby never announces who. He never announces how long. Anything. If you want to know whether or not a Georgia player is going to be suspended for a game, you have to tune into the game and see if the guy's playing or not. That's the only way you'll ever know. They're so secretive. They act like anything football related is a government nuclear secret. It's aggravating as hell. They lie about injuries all the time. They don't tell you anything. And it's their right to do that, but anyway, it's aggravating. I do think there will be several players suspended for a game or games this season. Now, I think anybody that got arrested for a driving-related offense should be suspended game 1 this season. That's just my opinion. It's not a judgment of the player. Again, a lot of these kids are young. It's their first time making any type of mistake or whatever. I'm not coming down on them at all. It's not the end of the world, what most of them did. Ra Thomas is a separate situation. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you get a speeding ticket, you get a racing ticket, whatever the case, should you be doing it? No. Does it mean you're a career criminal? No. These things happen, right? So I'm not talking about any one particular case. But Georgia can't afford to deal with these problems on an individual case basis any longer. The perception at Georgia has gotten so bad, and I can't argue against it. I can't. 25 arrests in 18 months. And you got to remember, the 25 arrests come after 2 people were killed racing. It's a terrible look. It's a terrible look. I've said this before. If a player is going to be suspended, he should be suspended for the next game on the schedule, not a cherry-picked game later down the road. What does that mean for the Clemson game? I don't know. It's possible ETN doesn't play in the Clemson game. He was charged with DUI. It was pled down to reckless driving. So he wasn't convicted of DUI. They pled it down to reckless driving. Maybe he gets suspended for the first game. Smallman, then starting inside linebacker, racing a couple of weeks ago, should probably be suspended for the first game. And you can go down the list. I'm not going to name all the players. That's irrelevant. I've told you how many there are. 25. That's over the last 18 months now. I don't think somebody that did something a year and a half ago should be sitting out a game now. But, this current offseason, if they're going to get serious about the problem, they need to start sitting these players down. The most valuable thing a player has is playing time, period. Not NIL money, not a scholarship, not free food, not free medical, or all these benefits they get for playing football at a big-time program. All that stuff is great and valuable. The most valuable thing a high-profile college athlete has at a major power program is playing time. Why? Playing time is the only way to get to the next level, the NFL, which is where you get the generational life-changing money. It's time to start taking it away. Just my opinion. Again, not judging the players. I'm judging Kirby. I don't think he's done enough. I don't think he's been upfront enough about the problem and what he is doing to address it. And so I think it needs to change. And I would not be at all surprised to see several players sat out of this Clemson game. Here's the bigger issue to me. I think it's an issue when the focus around a team in the offseason is not football related. We've seen this a couple of times over the last several years. We're seeing it right now with Florida State, right? They feel they got shafted at the end of last season. They then took a 60-point beating in the Orange Bowl, and they've got all these lawsuits going on. And there's so much going on in and around the Florida State program that is not related to playing football games in 2024. I have openly questioned how much of an effect or an impact is that going to have on them this season. I think you can say the same thing about Georgia. Now, here's the problem with saying that. It's unprovable. Like there's nothing that could happen game-wise this year with Georgia where you can, with certainty, say, oh, man, Georgia lost this game, and then draw a line directly back to, well, maybe they shouldn't have been racing this offseason. It doesn't work that way. Same thing with Florida State or any other team that's had bad off seasons that then struggle during the season. But I do think it has an impact and an effect. And that would worry me. And it does worry me. Georgia's my favorite team. Did it affect Georgia last year? Georgia had a terrible offseason last year. Last January was when those two players, one player and one member of the recruiting staff were killed in that car accident. They then had a bunch of arrests last offseason after that, leading up to the season. Did it affect Georgia last year? I don't know. They went 12-0, but I know they were losing to South Carolina and Auburn at halftime in the first month of the season. Teams that normally they blow out. You go back and you look at Georgia's two national title winning seasons. Were they losing to teams like South Carolina and Auburn at halftime? No. Now, maybe that means the team wasn't as good, or maybe some of those distractions in the offseason bled over to the season. Again, there's no way to prove that. Then, of course, they lost to Alabama in the SEC title game. There's no way to prove any of that. I just feel like, the more things you have going on around your football program that are not related to football, that's not a good thing. I think at least that's something we can all agree on, right? I don't like the Jaden Rashada lawsuit against Florida and Billy Napier. I don't know why we would bring somebody in knowing that he's actively suing another SEC pro. Yeah, it's funny, like for us, for idiots on the internet like me to point and laugh, your player getting sued, your coach is getting sued by one of our players. But do you need that type of distraction? I don't think you do. And for what? The guy's not playing this year unless Carson Beck breaks a leg. I don't see the upside in bringing him in. There were other quarterbacks. We did need another quarterback. That's a fact. But there were other ones I think he could have brought in. And again, that's not to say anything about Jaden Rashada's ability, potential, or what I think he might do when and if he ever plays quarterback for Georgia. It's just that's a non-football related issue that do we need that in the program? Do these players, is it good that these players are going to be constantly asked about tickets and racing and speeding and off-season arrests? Is it good that Kirby and the coaching staff is going to constantly be asked about that? Is that helping? So even if you don't think it's hurting, I think you would at least agree it doesn't help anything. They got to get this under control. How do they? People keep saying, well, what's the answer, Lou? I don't make $13 million a year to run that program. Kirby does. Kirby needs to find the solution, not me. The comparisons to 2006 through 8 Florida under Urban Meyer are pretty accurate right now. They're pretty accurate. And it's probably something that Georgia fans are just going to have to learn to deal with for the rest of their life. And 10 years from now, when somebody brings up the early 2020 Georgia Bulldogs and how great they were, the first thing some Florida fan or Bama fan or whatever fan is going to say was, well, yeah, but half the team got arrested. I mean, that's something Georgia fans are going to have to deal with. Florida fans deal with it. Miami fans deal with it back before that. It's just the way it is. Kirby's got to get a hold of this. People go, oh, you guy wants Kirby fired. No, I don't want Kirby fired, which is why I think he needs to get a hold of this situation, because I've made this point a couple of times. I'll make it again now. If over the next 18 months, okay, the last 18 months, 25 arrests, 2 dead people, all right? If I were to tell you that over the next 18 months, there would be another 25 arrests and another 2 dead bodies over the next 18 months, do you think Kirby Smart would be the head coach at Georgia 19 months from now? I don't. And I don't want that. I want Kirby to be the head coach today, tomorrow, 19 months from now, 10 years from now. Whatever he's doing is not working. He's got to do something different. All right, here's the schedule. Let's put it up on the screen, go through it game by game, and I give you a winner and a loser for every single week. All right, I've done a bunch of preview and prediction videos, so a lot of these games, if you've watched my other prediction videos, you already know which way I'm going, so I'm going to put those up on the screen now. I've done a Clemson video. I think Georgia beats Clemson. I think Clemson is a team headed in the wrong direction. I've talked about this a bunch. They won the national title in 2018. They lost 1 game in 2019. They lost 2 games in 2020. They lost 3 games in 2021. They lost 3 games in 2022, and they lost 4 games in 2024. I mean, it's a direct downward line from 2018 to now. They bring back Cade Klubnik. Clemson turned the ball over in every single game last year. Cade Klubnik is not a good quarterback. Their offensive line is below average. They don't have any wide receivers named T. Higgins or Sammy Watkins or DeAndre Hopkins or anybody else that you can name. That doesn't mean they're all terrible, but they don't have the superstar wide receivers. It's a massive drop-off at the quarterback position. And when you look at running back, I like Maffa, but without Will Shipley, I think Maffa takes a step back. They don't have any other proven running back on that team. You ask anybody, you even ask most Clemson fans to name any of Clemson's running backs, they're going to say, well, we got Maffa, we had Shipley last year, but he's gone. They can't name the next one. That's not to say they're not any good, but they're unproven and they're inexperienced. And it's better to have 2 good running backs, and this is just my opinion. It's better to have 2 good running backs than 1 great one. I think Shipley and Maffa are both really good. But without Shipley, I don't expect Maffa to have the type of production he had with Shipley. He's still going to be really good, but their offensive line is bad. They got no wide receivers. The quarterback is terrible. And you look over on the defensive side of the ball, I think they'll be really good defensively. But they were really good defensively last year, and they lost 4 games, got blown out by Duke, 28-7. I just don't think Clemson has what it takes right now to beat this Georgia roster. I think Georgia gets the win. Tennessee Tech, at home, Georgia's first home game of the year. The Clemson game's a neutral site in Atlanta. 2 years ago when Georgia-Clemson played, that game was in Charlotte, so this is kind of the return the favor game in Atlanta. I think Georgia beats Clemson. They'll beat Tennessee Tech at home. You get to see a bunch of backups and true freshmen play. And then a very interesting game on the road at Kentucky. Kentucky's quarterback, Brock Vandagriff, first-year starter, just transferred from Georgia. And I really like Brock Vandagriff. And Georgia fans have really liked Brock Vandagriff for 3 years. He's a big, tall guy who can run. He's a much better athlete from the waist down than what Carson Beck is. But Brock Vandagriff has been at Georgia year after year after year, and he's behind Stetson Bennett, and now he's behind Carson Beck, so I don't blame him at all for transferring. And Kentucky is one of these teams that they don't recruit at an elite level, so every single year they go out and they bring in sort of a mercenary QB. They brought the guy in from Penn State a couple of years ago. They brought the guy in from NC State last year, and now they're going with Brock Vandagriff. I think Brock Vandagriff's got a ton of potential, but we've never seen him play any meaningful time in college. We'll see how he does. And it is a home game for Kentucky, but again, Georgia's just had Kentucky's number. Kentucky has beat Georgia, I think, once in the last 25 years or something, and that was about 15 years ago. I just don't see it happening this year. Kentucky still needs to improve at a wide receiver position, and sort of the Kentucky has similar problems to what Notre Dame had a lot under Brian Kelly. Notre Dame's really good on the lines, Kentucky is really good along the lines of scrimmage. In fact, Kirby Smart says every year that Kentucky is probably the toughest, most physical team Georgia plays outside of Alabama. So they're really good along the lines of scrimmage, just like Notre Dame was under Brian Kelly. but they don't have the skill position players on the outside and in the secondary. They don't, and that shows up for Kentucky when they play sort of the most talented rosters. It shows up. I think it shows up again. I think Georgia, in a tough game, gets a win on the road against Kentucky. Then they have their first bye week. Got to remember, everybody gets 2 bye weeks this year because there's an extra week between the start of the season and conference championship Saturday. So play 3 games here, get a bye week, and then one of the biggest games of the year anywhere in college football, particularly for Georgia, is on the road at Alabama. Now, I did this Alabama video yesterday, so you already know where I'm headed here, but this is a must-win game for Georgia. Not must win in terms of, well, if they lose it, they're not making the playoffs, or if they lose it, they're not making the SEC title game, or if they lose it, they're going 500 from now to the end of time. Kirby has dominated the college football world basically for the last 4 years outside of Alabama. They haven't lost a game to anybody other than Alabama since the COVID season. But Kirby has struggled mightily against Alabama. Now, Nick Saban was the coach that entire time, and I happen to think he's the best coach in all of college football. Georgia's got to get over that hump this year. With Saban gone and a first-year head coach there. I like Kalen DeBoer. I think he's a great coach. But Kirby Smart's a great coach, too. And you can only use the getting out-coached excuse against the same team so many times, especially when that team has now changed coaches. You go back and you look at the matchups Georgia has had with Alabama, particularly the big games that Georgia has lost. You go back to 2017, national title game. Georgia was beating Bama at halftime. What happened? Out-coached in the second half. Okay, Kirby was a second-year coach. He got outcoached by the greatest coach of all time in the second half of that game. The balls that Nick Saban gets a lot of credit, and he deserves it all. He doesn't get enough credit for the change he made in that national title game. That's probably the ballsiest quarterback change that anybody has ever made in the history of college football. You got a guy there that's got you to the national title game, and just because you're losing at halftime, you're going to yank him out and put the kid in that's never played? And, of course, it worked. Nick Saban's a genius, but outcoached in the second half. The following year, 2018, the SEC championship game, Georgia was winning at halftime. Lost the game. Why? Outcoached in the second half. 2020, the COVID year, Georgia and Bama played in the regular season on the road in Tuscaloosa. Who was winning at halftime? Georgia. Who won the game? Bama. Why? Georgia got outcoached in the second half. Are you starting to see a pattern here? Georgia has had teams capable of beating Alabama almost every time they've played. They got outcoached in the second half. That can't continue now with a coaching change at Alabama. I'm doing a series of must-win games. You might have seen some of them. This is a must-win game for Georgia. They can't afford to drop this on the road at Bama. The perception of losing to Bama again this year, now that Saban's gone, would be bad. Again, not something that Georgia can't recover from. Georgia could lose the Bama game and still get a first-round bye in the college football playoff if they run the table and win the SEC championship game. I just mean from a program standpoint, a perception, kind of the way people look at things. You got to go in there and win this game. I think Georgia finds a way to do it. They're undefeated. Come back home, play Auburn. Auburn played Georgia tough last year. Hugh Freeze's first year there. But that was in Auburn. This is in Athens. Auburn is 3-17 against Georgia in the last 20 years. I mean, Georgia's just dominated this series. I still think Auburn needs a quarterback. I've told you before, I like Hugh Freeze. I think he'll get Auburn to a much better position than Brian Harsin had them. And look, they're recruiting great too. They got top 10 recruiting class right now. We'll see if it holds up until December when these kids can sign, but they're recruiting well, and they've got some talent on that team. But certain offenses and certain coaches have to have a quarterback to make the offense go, and the Hugh Freeze offense is that way. He's got to have a guy in there that can run that offense, and they don't have that right now. They just don't. Peyton Thorne is not the answer. But it looks like they're going with him again this year. I think Georgia gets to win at home against Auburn. Back-to-back home games. They host Mississippi State the following week. Third different head coach in 3 years for Mississippi State. You had a tragic passing of Mike Leach. They then promoted the defensive coordinator, Will Arnett, got rid of him after last year. So this is the third year in a row that Mississippi State will have a new head coach. They're one of the least talented teams in the SEC, and they got to play in Athens. Georgia hasn't lost in Athens since, 2019? It's been a long time since Georgia. Does Georgia have the longest home winning streak in college football? It's one of them. They haven't lost a home game since 2019, maybe 2018. Anyway, it was South Carolina, by the way. Jake Fromm had 4 turnovers. Shout out Jack Fromm. But Georgia will get the job done at home against the fake Bulldogs of Mississippi State. And then another sort of game of the year situation here on the road at Texas. Now, again, I've done a Texas version of this video, so you know where I'm headed. While Georgia's busy beating up on a terrible Mississippi State team and potentially resting their starters in the second half, if that's what they choose to do, guess what Texas is doing the week before the Texas-Georgia game? They're playing Oklahoma in the Red River Shootout. Now, I think Texas is better than Oklahoma and probably wins the game, but I thought Texas was better than Oklahoma last year, and they lost. This is the biggest game of the year for Texas every year, period, no matter what. On top of that, it's a huge revenge game for Texas. It's an emotional game. It's a competitive game. Like, it doesn't get any bigger than Oklahoma, Texas. I find it hard to believe that Texas is going to be able to beat Oklahoma or lose to Oklahoma and then get up the following week to play one of the best teams in all of college football, Georgia. I think Georgia goes into Austin and gets what at that point will probably be the biggest win anybody has of the college football season. Then they have their second bye week to come out of that, the cocktail party, the rivalry game against Florida. Florida's an absolute just dumpster fire. Billy Napier probably in his last year there. I hope Florida somehow finds a way to win enough games that they have to keep Billy Napier. That would be great for me and everybody else that's not Florida, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think he will be fired. I think they'll have a new coach next season. And Billy Napier doesn't have what it takes to beat Kirby Smart and this Georgia team. I think Florida gets the win. Then they go on the road and play Ole Miss before hosting Tennessee. So let's take a look at these three games here. Florida, huge rivalry game, right? What did I say about Texas and Oklahoma? Doesn't matter how good or bad you think Oklahoma is, or if you think Texas is, none of that matters. I say huge rivalry game. Same thing here. Georgia, Florida. Huge rivalry game, emotional game, tough physical game, right? And then Georgia's got to turn around and go on the road and play a top 10 Ole Miss team, and Georgia's going to lose that game. I hate that. Georgia has never won at Ole Miss. They haven't played there since Kirby's first year. Kirby took the Dogs out to Ole Miss in his first year back in 2016 and got absolutely blown out of something like 45-17. I don't think Georgia's getting blown out 45-17, but I do think sandwiched between this Florida and Tennessee game, that Ole Miss game on the road, too tough. It comes at the wrong point on the schedule, and I think Georgia drops that one to Ole Miss. They come back home against Tennessee and rebound. I think Tennessee will be a good team, but they're not beating Georgia in Athens. First-year starter in Nico, and if you look at Heupel's offense, as good as it's been the last couple of years, they struggle to get first downs against this Kirby Smart defense every single year. Kirby, for whatever reason, has figured out this Josh Heupel offense, whether it's a talent mismatch or a coaching mismatch. Y'all can argue about that in the comment section. What you can't argue is that in 3 years, they've scored 4 touchdowns against this Georgia defense. It's just been really, really bad for Tennessee against Georgia. Now, next year, Georgia will have a first-year starting quarterback, and they will be going on the road to Knoxville to play a second-year Nico, and Tennessee could very well get that win. I don't think it's happening this year in Athens. I think Georgia beats Tennessee. They go 2-1 in this big stretch of 3 games right here: Florida, Ole Miss, Tennessee. Come back home for a nap and beat UMass for no reason in November, and then Georgia Tech, a home game. I think Georgia will beat Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech's improving. They gave Georgia a great game last year in Atlanta. Again, this one's in Athens. Tough to beat the Dogs there. Rivalry game. There's been some conversation about whether or not teams will sit players in rivalry weekend. I'm going to have to see that before I believe it, especially with a guy like Kirby Smart, who played at Georgia, who understands the importance of the Georgia Tech game. Does the Georgia Tech game matter? Not really, especially if Georgia's sitting there at 10-1. They already will have punched their ticket to Atlanta for the SEC championship game. They could lose to Georgia Tech by 1,000. They're still going to go to Atlanta the next week and play in the SEC championship game, where if they win, they'll get a first-round bye. I really hope teams don't start doing that. There's a lot of things I wished wouldn't have happened, though, that have in the last few years. So I hope we don't see that. I don't think we will, and I think Georgia gets the win against an improved and pretty good Georgia Tech team. If you've seen my Georgia Tech preview, I think you know I'm pretty high on Georgia Tech. So there it is. I've got Georgia at 11-1. Here's my issues here. I don't think Georgia's winning all 4 of these road games. They don't. So here's some other games Georgia could lose. They could lose to Clemson in Atlanta. Now, of all the games they play outside of Athens, that's probably the one they're least likely to lose. I think Georgia's got a better chance of losing on the road at Kentucky than they do losing in Atlanta to Clemson. At Bama, clearly they could lose that game. Bama's one of the most talented teams in the country, especially if Kalen DeBoer is able to work some type of magic with Jalen Milroe and develop his passing game, which does need developing. Alabama fans have to realize not every quarterback comes out of the womb perfect, even at Alabama. Jalen Milroe was a good player last year. He was not great. He was good. He was great with his legs. He was pretty average when it came to throwing the ball. But Kalen DeBoer was a wizard with Michael Penix. If he can do that with Jalen Milroe and that offense can get going, they're already going to have one of the best running games in the country with those running backs they got in that offensive line. And if their defense, I've got some concerns about the Alabama defense, but if for some reason the defense is up to par, of course Bama can beat Georgia. We've seen them do it a bunch of times since Kirby Smart took over. So, of course, Bama could win that game. Texas is capable of beating Georgia. Here's the thing. You take any of these teams, Bama, Texas, Ole Miss in particular, if Georgia plays those three teams 10 times each, those teams are going to beat Georgia some of the time. Georgia's going to beat them some of the time. They don't play 10 times each. They only play once, right? So you got to figure out, okay? They only play once. What's it going to be? It's so important for Georgia to win that Bama game. I feel like they find a way to do it. I think they beat Texas because of where that game falls on the schedule for Texas, coming right after that Oklahoma game. And then I think they lose to Ole Miss because of where it falls on the schedule for Georgia, in between the Florida-Tennessee game, right after the Florida game, an unfamiliar environment. Georgia hasn't played there since 2016, so there's not a single player on Georgia's team that's ever played there. It seems to work out that way. I think Ole Miss beats the Dogs at home. I think Georgia finishes it out with wins against Tennessee, UMass, and Georgia Tech. So I've got Georgia dropping their first regular season game since 2020, 11-1. That would put them in the SEC title game. Georgia could go 9-3. I find it hard to believe Georgia would go any worse than 9-3. In order for Georgia to go 9-3, you'd have to basically think they're losing all three of their biggest games. And I just don't think that's going to be the case. Kirby's got a really good record against the top 10. Georgia was 3-1 against top 10 teams last year. They beat Florida State. They beat Missouri. They beat Ole Miss. And then, of course, lost to Bama. There's 3 top 10 teams on here. Bama, top 10. Texas, top 10. Ole Miss, top 10. They probably can, 2-1. 2-1 is really good against those 3 teams, all 3 of which are on the road. Could they lose all 3 of them? I guess it's possible. But with a returning quarterback and that much experience and just the pure talent that they have, I find it hard to believe they lose all 3. I'm going to go with 11-1 for the Dogs in 2024 and a trip to the SEC title game. All right, appreciate you watching. Be sure and let me know down below what an idiot I am, and have a good morning.